Hey, welcome everybody, and good afternoon and good morning from wherever you are. First of all, traditionally, I like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands and waterways in which we are passing through today. And I'm currently talking from Camaragal country, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging for the continued custodianship of all our lands. And without any further ado, before I hand over to Will, who's getting to the pointy end of his PhD with his final year review, I'd like to introduce the final year review panel today. Our two wonderful experts is Associate Professor Keon Yap and Dr. Hairen Zhang, who are all led by our chair, Professor Teresa Dickey. And also like to acknowledge Will's supervisory panel today. Luke Downey, who's the Associate Supervisor End User, and his two co-supervisors, Professor Joseph Sirachi and Dr. Maddie Fraser, all led by the most excellent Professor Baljinder Sandra. And so I'd just like to say for those apart from Will, please make sure you're mute. Will, you have to unmute yourself for a second, and the floor is yours. Thanks, Will.
So thanks, Ricky. All right, small crowd today. That's nice. So yes, welcome everyone to the latest episode and hopefully season finale of Will's PhD, titled "What Works for Whom: An Individualized Approach to Identifying Determinants of Wellbeing in Youth." Excuse me. All right, so I feel like I've got a lot to smash through today, so let's get ready to rumble. So I guess I want to start off by giving a brief overview of what my PhD is about. So at the moment around the world, we're experiencing a bit of a youth mental health crisis. And just as worryingly, the current interventions that we're using aren't exactly improving in treatment efficacy. So one solution that's been proposed is the idea of personalization. And so my PhD, the overall goal was to introduce a novel-driven approach to personalizing intervention in youth. So this approach to personalization can be broken down into a three-step sort of framework. So the first step is we need to assess by collecting intensive longitudinal data about different processes, which are things that produce change and outcomes using EMA. Step two is then we want to then analyze that data using new and existing machine learning or statistical methods and approaches to be able to identify, I guess, important process or predictor and outcome links. And then the last step to this approach is, well, we need to personalize. So we need to make treatment recommendations for the individual based on the results from step two, analyze. And again, to introduce sort of this approach, so my PhD is broken down into three studies. So the first study was a scoping review and meta-analysis that compared personalized to standardized interventions and basically asked the question, should we even personalize? Spoiler alert, and thank God we should, otherwise I wouldn't have much of a PhD. The second study was a simulation study that aligns well with sort of step two of this framework, analyze. So the goal of the simulation study was to sort of compare and explore the weaknesses and strengths of various existing and new statistical and machine learning approaches to see how they perform in terms of identifying important process outcome links. And then finally, study three was a feasibility and acceptability study. So now that we know we should personalize, we sort of have the tools or we figured out what tools we can use to sort of analyze, then we need to be able to ask the question, okay, one, how do we make these treatment recommendations to the client and the clinicians, and how can we implement this sort of approach into a real-world clinical setting? So in the MCR, I presented the results of study one and part one of the simulation study. So today in the final year review, what I'm going to do is present the results of part two of the simulation study and the results of my feasibility study. So before we jump straight into part two of the simulation study, I thought it'd be good to give a brief recap of what part one is about so that the results and what I talk about makes a bit more sense. So like I said, the goal of the simulation study was to compare the sort of strengths and weaknesses of various statistical machine learning approaches, new and old, at how well they identify individual or important individual process or predictor and outcome links. So to do that, we simulated data sets with known contemporaneous relationships, and we created various conditions by varying things like autocorrelation, trends, within sample size and number of variables. What we then did is that any simulated contemporaneous relationship between a predictor and an outcome that was larger than 0.2, we labeled as a known important predictor, so sort of the true values. We used 0.2 as a threshold because one, that's sort of considered common and meaningful in psychology research, And also in the treatment literature, sort of effect sizes of 0.2 have been found to have practical value. So the statistical and machine learning, or the approaches that we looked at, were IRMX and multivariate IRMX, two time series forecasting models or approaches, GIME and INSEM, individual structural equation modeling, which we've grouped together as sort of network approaches, iBaruta, a tree-based machine learning model, and the novel time series Bruta that was sort of created as part of the simulation study. That's a hybrid model that combines both IRMX and iBaruta together. So what we did is, we ran each of these approaches on all of the data sets, and then we compared what we labeled as known important to those identified as important by each of these approaches. And to measure performance, we used 4 metrics, so sensitivity, specificity, precision, F1 score. And these performance metrics were calculated for each simulation, and then the metrics aggregated across the 100 simulations for each condition with mean and 95% confidence interval. So what we found in part 1 was that IRMX excelled across all the different conditions and performed the best, followed by iBaruta. But with iBaruta, once time series elements like autocorrelations and trends were added into the data, its performance dropped significantly. So to sort of try and fix that problem, we created time series Bruta, which, like I said, is a hybrid model or approach that combines both IRMX and iBaruta. And then it counts for those time series elements like autocorrelations and trends. And what we found was that time series Bruta also performed quite well, but still not as well as IRMX. So one thing we have to note, though, is that part 1 of the simulation study, all those conditions looked at linear effects only. And a key advantage of tree-based machine learning approaches like iBaruta or time series Bruta is their distribution-free design, which doesn't constrain them to only linear data or effects. So by looking at only linear effects and linear data, we might have been giving a bit of an unfair advantage to approaches that are sort of more designed for that type of data like IRMX. So naturally, it made sense that part 2 of the simulation study, we would look at sort of nonlinear effects and see how well these approaches perform in these conditions. And I think it's really important because obviously clinical real world data isn't always nice and linear. There's always a bit of mess in there. So to do that, we simulated data sets with quadratic effects between the predictor and the outcome, and we also simulated data sets with interaction effects. And so based on the theory, we hypothesized that, tree-based machine learning models would probably would be likely to outperform time series and network approaches. So for the quadratic effects, we simulated data with 70 time points, 102 individuals, 5 predictors and 1 outcome, and 100 sort of data sets on that. And these simulation features were identical to the linear simulations. So I'm just going to drink water. And same as in the linear simulations, we used a threshold of 0.2 to classify known importance. So any predictor with a quadratic coefficient larger than 0.2, we labeled as a known important. So for the interaction effects, we created a data set with a crossover interaction, whereby the value of a variable or predictor Z impacts or influences a variable or predictor X's relationship with the outcome. So if Z was 1, then X had a negative relationship with the outcome. And if Z was 0, then X had a positive relationship with the outcome. And in this condition, we had 50% of the individuals with the interaction. And those, if there was an interaction, we would label those variables as known important, and 50% without that interaction. So for the interaction effect, we had we both looked at 70 time points and also 150 time points. Right. And in terms of the results, what we found can sort of be well summarized in this figure here. If we focus on the 2 metrics of sensitivity and F1 score, so sensitivity is the proportion of known important predictors correctly identified by each approach, and F1 score is the balance measure that combines precision and sensitivity into a single metric. Sorry if it's a bit small. So if we look at specificity, which is this dark green column, and F1 score, this light blue one, we can see that both iBaruta and time series Bruta were the only approaches that really were able to identify these nonlinear quadratic effects, as represented by their relatively high and decent sensitivity and F1 scores. If we look at the other approaches, sensitivity and F1 were quite low, indicating that they weren't really able to identify any of those known important predictors when there's nonlinearity. So in terms of interaction effects, what we found was that GIME and INSEM, the network approaches, weren't unable to identify any interaction effects. IRMAX and multivariate IRMAX were able to identify the interaction effect, but only if we specified that specific interaction effect into the model before we ran it. Whilst this might be sort of feasible, I guess, in smaller data sets with less number of variables, I think as the data sets get larger and there's more variables in that data set, it could become quite tedious and computationally intensive and possibly not really that effective or plausible. And lastly, iBrood and time series brooder were able to identify those interacting variables, and they seem to do better and perform better when there are more number of time points in the data. So I guess I quickly want to give a quick summary as well of both the linear and non-linear results of the simulation study. And to do that, I want to focus specifically, or more specifically, on two main metrics, specificity and F1 score. So specificity is the proportion of true negatives, so things that are actually not important that are correctly identified as not important by an approach. And high specificity means less false positives. And I think that's critical for avoiding wasted intervention efforts on things that aren't actually important. And speaking as a clinician, I definitely, I think I've seen, in practice as well, like wasting time working on things that aren't actually important can often be quite detrimental to sort of client motivation to therapy and rapport and things like that. And the other sort of metric I want to focus on is F1 score, which is, again, a combination of sensitivity and precision. And it's great for assessing clinical decision-making where both accuracy and completeness matter. So if we look at this scatter plot, that plots the specificity and F1 score for each condition for each approach. So each of these X's represents the specificity and F1 score for that approach in one specific condition of the simulations. These dotted lines are sort of what is generally considered an acceptable range based on the literature for each of these metrics. That's about 0.8 for specificity and around 0.7 for F1 score. And so ideally what we want for an approach is that all those X's are clustered in the sort of top right quadrant, which sort of signifies that they have both a high specificity and high F1 score. And as we can see from here, time series brooder, this one in the top right, sort of stands out where all those X's are clustered in that top right quadrant, whilst for the rest of the approaches, they're spread out a little bit more. However, with IRMX, it's shown to have quite a high F1 score and a relatively acceptable specificity, and it is sort of clustered in that top right corner as well, if not for these three X's down the bottom here. And actually those three X's represent the sort of nonlinear conditions, so the two interactions and the quadratic effects down there, which, yeah. So in conclusion, sort of the conclusion that I came to was a combination of IRMAX and time series brooder together would be ideal. So each has sort of strengths and weaknesses. IRMAX excels at identifying linear effects, as we found in part 1 of the simulation study. It also gives you a direction of effect, which can be helpful, and it has high sensitivity. So it's picking up a large proportion of those sort of true or known important predictors. On the other hand, time series brooder excels at identifying nonlinear effects, and interaction effects, and it has a very high specificity. So it's very conservative. So it doesn't pick up many false positives. And so if we're to use them in combination, if they both identified a predictor as important, then we can be sort of very, very, very sure that it's actually important. Whilst if IRMAX doesn't identify it as important, but time series brooder does, then there's a very high possibility that there's non-linearity in the data there. And so I also did run IRMAX and time series brooder together in combination on a real empirical EMA data set that looked at things like loneliness and self-disclosure on the outcome of depressed mood, to give a sort of brief demonstration on how they could be used in combination. And I'll give a brief example of one individual from that data set, so individual 57. So for that person, the predictors of loneliness and other disclosure, both IRMAX and time series brooder identified those predictors as important. For the predictor of responsiveness or perceived responsiveness of others in social interactions, IRMAX didn't identify as important, but time series brooder did. And for self-disclosure and perceived social interaction satisfaction, both IRMAX and time series brooder didn't identify that as important. So in combination, if loneliness and other disclosure, both of the approaches identified as important, we can be quite sure that these are genuinely important. For responsiveness, like we said, because IRMAX didn't identify it as important, but time series burrito did, there's a high possibility of nonlinearity. And when we ran tests of nonlinearity on that responsiveness data, it was significant. So there is nonlinearity there. So for this individual, what we would do, we would target all three of those approaches: learningness, other disclosure, and responsiveness. So we could increase behavioral activation to sort of reduce loneliness. We could provide social skills training to improve their ability to disclose things to others. And we could potentially do something like cognitive restructuring to address maybe negative beliefs about perceived responsiveness of other people. All right. And so, yeah, that was the end of the simulation study, which leads well into the feasibility study. So now that we know personalization works from study one, we've identified the analytical tools we can use to sort of analyze. The next question is then, well, one, how do we communicate these results to clients and clinicians? And also, how do we implement this type of approach into a real world clinical setting? And so obviously that's the aim of the feasibility study. Feasibility studies, they sort of ask the question whether something can be done, if it should be done, and if so, how can it be done? And they're also, well, feasibility studies are also, I think, a sort of critical first step in assessing key implementation outcomes like uptake, acceptability, engagement, sustainability, and things like that. And I think they also assist in identifying potential barriers or facilitators that might influence whether an approach like the one from my PhD can be successfully implemented or integrated into sort of routine mental health care. So for the feasibility study, I hypothesized that there would be generally positive youth perceptions around the approach, but there would be a lot of challenges around compliance and motivation with those EMA daily surveys. So that's step one of the framework, the assess. I also hypothesized that there'd be generally favorable clinician perceptions and attitudes towards this approach. So what we aimed to do was to get 10 to 20 youth clinician pairs. We would get the youth to do 2 weeks of EMA data collection on their mobile phone. And then we would run time series burrito and IRMAX on their data and create a personalized summary report to give to the clinicians. However, as the panel very, very wisely warned me in my MCR, there were quite a lot of challenges around recruitment. In fact, after 1.5 months of active recruitment, we only managed to recruit 2 youth participants. So we did need to make a slight, well, actually, for the sake of time and also my sanity and stress levels, we had to make a slight pivot in the study to focus more so on clinician perceptions and attitudes instead. However, I think it's important to note that these recruitment challenges in itself, I think, is an important feasibility finding for the study, and that it does support the hypothesis that, yeah, there would be challenges around youth compliance for the EMA daily surveys and things like that. So in terms of the pivot, what we aim to do was, instead of taking real client data, we created a simulated client and ran IRMAX and time series burrito on that simulated client's data and created a personalized summary report. That sort of looked like this. So we aimed not to make it too text dense. We wanted some sort of visuals and figures and things like that. There's some information around the different processes being measured and some treatment recommendations that give sort of questions that can help explore what these processes mean for each client, and some client resources that have some strategies and things like that as well. So what we did is we created an online survey instead for clinicians to complete. They were provided a vignette about the simulated client, a bit of information around the sort of how the data would have been collected and sort of how it is analyzed. And then we presented them that personalized summary report to look at. And after that, we gave them 11 feasibility and acceptability statements that were scored on a scale of 0 to 100. So these were positively geared statements, things like, I found the summary report helpful overall. And higher scores indicated higher agreement with these sort of statements, these positively geared statements. We also had 4 open-ended questions and 1 willingness rating on a 5-point Likert scale. So in the end, we had 48 clinicians complete the online survey. There was a range of experience from very new, like 1 year, to very experienced, 30 years. Majority of them were psychologists, and majority of them worked in private practice. So in terms of the results, what we found was that, as we sort of hypothesized, in terms of clinician perceptions, there were generally favorable perceptions around the benefits, the acceptability, and the helpfulness of both the report and the sort of approach. So if we look at figure 4, this shows the mean confidence interval and the spread of clinician responses as well for the 11 different positively geared statements. So as we can see, generally they were quite high, indicating agreement with these positively geared statements, with the exception of this one here, YP willing, which was the statement that young people would be willing to complete those daily EMA surveys. And as we can see from here, the mean was quite low and there was quite a wide spread. So quite a lot of people or clinicians didn't agree that youth would be willing to complete this, while some, agreed as well. But generally there was more of a sort of not disagreement, but spread around how much clinicians agreed that youth would be willing to complete those surveys, which I think supports, our recruitment challenges and also supports the hypothesis that that would probably be the most challenging part in terms of implementation. Some other interesting points is that the statement complements. So that statement was that the report or the results of the report complements rather than replaces clinical judgment. And there was quite a high agreement with clinicians for that. And I think that's important because I think it shows that how we frame this type of approach and this type of report can be really important in terms of facilitating or even acting as a barrier to uptake or implementation of this sort of approach. The other one was more understanding. So the statement that I would need more understanding before I'd be willing to use this type of approach was quite highly agreed with for most clinicians as well. And again, I think that's important because that could act as a potential facilitator. So we might need to provide more information and more training to clinicians to help with uptake and implementation of this type of approach. But importantly, on the willingness rating, 70% of clinicians said that they would be willing to use this type of report and approach in their clinical practice. 13% were unsure, and only 16% said they weren't willing to use something like this. We also did some subgroup analyses to see if perceptions would be different based on preferred treatment modalities and workplaces. And what we found, there was no major difference in those groups. We also did some exploratory correlational analyses. And what we found was that the more experienced the clinician was, the more willing they were to use this type of approach and report, the more they felt like clients would benefit, and the less understanding they felt like they would need before feeling confident to use this. We also looked at frequency of current measure use. So what we found was that clinicians who used measures more frequently at the moment actually, trusted this type of approach a bit less, thought it was less helpful, and were a bit less willing to use something like this. But it must be noted that, it's a very small sample size. These were exploratory analyses, and the effect sizes were quite small, negative 0.1, negative 0.2 sort of thing. We also did a reflexive thematic analysis using Braun and Clark's 6-phase approach for the 4 open-ended questions in the survey, and we came up with 4 final themes. So the first theme was that the visual presentation and structured summaries enhanced interpretability and clinical judgment engagement. The second theme was that the report supports targeted intervention planning and collaborative decision-making, clinical decision-making. The third theme was that feasibility barriers centered on youth adherence and burden, and there were also some concerns about interpretability and misapplication of results. And the last theme was that implementation will require training, integration with existing systems, and a low burden delivery support. So in terms of the conclusions of the feasibility study, I think there are 6 main talking points. So the first is that, it does seem clinicians are quite receptive and willing and have positive attitudes about this type of approach and the report. However, there is this theme of sort of burden versus benefit, where clinicians did feel like there was quite a lot of benefit to this, but they were also sort of concerned around the burden it places on youth clients in terms of that data collection, that EMA, which leads well into the next talking point, which is the main barrier was youth compliance. Based on both qualitative and quantitative data and the recruitment challenges, youth compliance was the major sort of factor there. But I think the results show that the barrier isn't necessarily the report or the approach itself. It may be more so how that data is collected, or the data collection sort of process. And I think, with the increase in terms of gamification of certain things and things like that, hopefully there's a solution to this sort of barrier there. One other possible solution is actually embedding this approach into a service. So with my study, it was something extra that clients had to do. And these are clients that are already engaged in therapy for obviously mental health challenges. and they might not have had the capacity to engage with the study and do something extra. So I think in the future, if we're able to embed this into a service as a sort of like a compulsory from the start sort of thing, that might help with managing those challenges around one, recruitment, and possibly compliance as well. Another thing that could be helped is training clinicians. So training was raised both in the quantitative and qualitative results as a potential barrier or facilitator to the uptake of this sort of approach. So I think in the future, before even recruitment starts, I think training clinicians on how this approach works, how the results are analyzed, how to interpret the report could really assist with both recruitment and compliance. And the last point is that, yeah, we did use simulated data because of the recruitment challenges. And like I said, with the simulation study, real world data can often be a bit more messy. So I think future studies where we actually give clinicians real world client data and see how they feel about the report and the approach then is really important. Sorry, I know I've got no time. So quickly, very lastly, I just want to do a quick conclusion. So overall, the end goal was to introduce a novel data-driven approach to personalization youth therapy. So my first study found that personalized interventions were more efficacious than standardized interventions. The simulation study identified time series Bruder and IRMax as two tools to use to assess individual data. The feasibility study found that clinicians were willing and receptive of this type of approach, but there were some implementation challenges, mainly around youth compliance and motivation in terms of the data collection. And so, yeah, I hope that my PhD paves the way for some future feasibility studies that can collect obviously real client data and hopefully down the track, some pilot studies and efficacy studies, because I think this is a really exciting area of research and hopefully, not hopefully, but I do feel like this is, the sort of future of clinical psychology. And lastly, just a quick timeline. Yeah, all I have left is hopefully just to write up thesis. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, William, for this excellent presentation and your excellent documents. I really enjoyed reading them. I loved your writing style as well. It was very helpful in reading a highly technical study 2 or second part of study 2. And this kind of also leads into my, I actually have a couple of questions. Some you already responded to also. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but one of the most important questions is, and I'm going to pull a Columbo and ask you to explain this to me as if I were a 4-year-old, right?
Okay.
So your first study was very technical. Your second study, not so much. So it was very accessible to me and also would be to clinical practitioners. In your first study, you did have some clinical implications, but yet they were still quite technical due to the nature of the paper. So could you explain, or how would you explain to a clinical psych practitioner what your study 2 means to them in practice? I know it's weaved into study 3, but yet I felt like you could boost a little bit on the practical applications of study 2, specifically if it goes to publication. And related to that, practically, and this is a two-parter, what I kind of understand, kind of do not understand is in order for those algorithms to do their thing and properly work, you need a lot of data from one person, right? So let's say I get that data. This is what I would ask myself as a clinical practitioner. I have to wait for a bit. And then I learn something. And so I change my approach. But then again, I have to wait for a bit in order for the algorithm to do its thing. So how does that work in practice?
Yep, definitely. Okay. No, thank you for the feedback first, Teresa. And I guess to answer the first part of your question, so yeah, that's a very good point because I think I've been so focused on the technical side of things and dreaming stats and R and stuff like that yeah, I think to take a step back and explain it to a clinician, I would say the idea behind it is that at the moment, in terms of treatment, we sort of I focus so much on group-based stuff where it's sort of like, okay, this person's depressed or this person's anxious, CBT or ACT works for majority of these people. But as we know from sort of statistics, just because it works for the majority or the average doesn't necessarily mean it works for everyone. So I think it's important that we are able to sort of individualize and personalize for each client. And study 2 helps us figure out the tools to do that in terms of my approach. So step 2, we need to analyze individual data. And so these different algorithms, their job is to sort of identify for each individual client, what processes are things that produce change. So these could be things like being compassionate to ourselves or being mindful. Because there's so many different, I guess, psychological constructs, variables, processes out there that we need to know, okay, well, what works for this person specifically? And so these algorithms and these approaches, their job is to be able to identify from that EMA data which ones are actually importantly linked to the outcome, whether that's depression or anxiety for that specific client. And so I guess the hope is that if we're able to identify, well, which ones can actually do this the best, which ones are actually properly telling us that, this is what it's saying is sort of true in that sense, it's accurate. And that's sort of the goal of the second study, to compare these different approaches to see how well they're actually doing this job of identifying important process and outcome links for specific individuals. And I think, down the track, hopefully in the future, if this is something that can be implemented into sort of treatment and becomes somewhat of the norm, then hopefully we don't need to waste as much time almost doing like what's it called, like a guess and check sort of thing, like, oh, okay, this approach or this strategy and targeting this process works for the majority of people, so let's try that with you. Oh, it doesn't work, okay, we'll have to try something else then. And that can obviously waste a lot of time, a lot of effort, and again, like I was mentioning, it might impact motivation and rapport and things like that. But using these algorithms and these models, if we can sort of just identify in a lot more efficiently, what works for this person, we can straight away focus on that and just make treatment, well, one, more efficacious, and also two, just more efficient. So hopefully that answers part one. So part two, I think your question was around sort of the data collection and then being able to apply that, but then needing to wait for more data. That's correct? Yeah. So I think with this, ideally, how it would be implemented would be sort of, either prior to therapy, but preferably probably, within the first session, to explain this sort of approach and the benefits to both the clinician and the client, and how it can help with therapy. And then from there, collecting maybe 2 weeks of data or 3 weeks of data, which, like you said, can be quite intensive, which, like I said, is probably one of the major barriers at this point. But I think after that data collection, we can analyze that data and sort of give clinicians this idea of, well, okay, for this person, this is what works. And I think at this point, the way I'm thinking about it is, well, we don't need to keep collecting that data. I think that data is a good snapshot of that individual client, and for at least, the next extended maybe 4, 5, 6 sessions. And then maybe down the track, if it's a long-term client, it could be something like every 3, every 4, every 5, 6 months. Then we might do another 2-week data collection just to see if things have changed. So I don't think it would be something necessarily always ongoing, that data collection through therapy. It's more of like at the start, we'd do that. We'd get an idea on what works for this person, and then we focus on those for a while. And then potentially down the track, because things change, life changes, all that sort of stuff, then we may want to do that sort of data collection again. But that's at this point in time. Like, I think I haven't thought necessarily that far ahead yet on how this would be rolled out and planned out at this point. But hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with that, I'll open to the 2 panel members. Who wants to go first? Put your hand up because I can't see you.
All right, Keon, thank you.
I'll go. Okay. First of all, Will, well done. It's such a pleasure to watch a little bit from the sidelines, the development of your thesis and development of all these studies. And I was particularly impressed with how you've pivoted and ensured that you still answered some of the important research questions that you want to put forward, even though your recruitment of participants was not as successful as you'd planned. So well done with that. I've got a few questions about which I must admit, I did have a look at your written work, but so you may have addressed some of these questions, but when there were a lot of equations, so I glazed over a number of the equations there.
Yep.
Now, with one of the issues here that you've mentioned is with feasibility. Now, were there differences between Aramax and TS Garuda with regards to the number of time points you need for data? Are the differences between that large enough such that one of these methods is more feasible than another?
So first of all, thank you, Kyung, for the feedback. And yeah, your very wise words around recruitment from the MCR ended up coming true. But yes, to answer your question, so yeah, I don't think you would have read that in part in the final year review, because that was covered more so in the MCR. And what we did find was that both time series Brooder and Iramax, there was a sweet spot around 70 to 100 time points, and they were both quite similar. So there was no difference, in that aspect either. Yeah.
Okay, and so with one thing we are noticing with a lot of sort of idionomic research is that we're not just finding individuals having the expected direction of the association. You talk about how loneliness might be, high loneliness might be associated with low social interaction, but sometimes you see, surprisingly for an individual, high loneliness is associated with high social interaction, for example. Can you speak about how accurate was the detection of the direction of the effects?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. No, good question and very good point. So I think that ended up being one of the slight drawbacks to time series Brooder, in the sense that Brooder doesn't actually tell you the direction of the effect. It will just tell you if a predictor is importantly related to the outcome, which is why I think that combination of IRMax and time series Brooder sort of is even better, because IRMax will give you that direction of effect. So it will tell you whether it's important or not, but also tell you whether it's a positive relationship or whether it's a negative relationship. Yeah, so that's why I think that combination works best as well.
That would be great. Yeah, as a clinician, I think when we look at, and I'm not surprised why those who do measurement regularly are less likely to say yes, because you I know already. I've given them this questionnaire. It's high. I'll just address the things that are high, But it may be high, but sometimes the relationship is the other way around, and you don't realize it. I think that selling of this, identifying of these relationships between variables is really important, and might help sell that to clinicians a little bit more. Now, I've got a couple more questions very quickly. And I just a comment, I agree with you, embedding is important. We all do questionnaires in our intervention, in our intake. I don't think you would like to fill in those questionnaires anyway as well. So if it's embedded, they'll do it. Tell them to do it, they do it. Was data collected for the two participants that you managed to recruit? And is there value maybe in reporting those findings as a pilot study? Just wondering, but no pressure.
So for one of those youth participants, they actually had a decent amount of time points collected. For the second one, I think they must have dropped out or forgot about it sort of halfway through, and that data really became not as useful, because there is a sort of there's no necessarily minimum, but from part one of the simulation study, what we found was with the less number of time points at like 30, 40 and below, some of these approaches, time series Brooder and Iramax, the sort of performance decreased quite a bit, where it wasn't as useful or feasible or accurate to use on that less number of time points. So I'm not sure if there's one. I mean, I guess it'd be like a case study, and I don't know if that's worth anything.
There's value in that.
Yeah,
but maybe a study to be considered as publication, because I mean this is so new, and to be it would make a contribution nonetheless, I think, even if it's one participant. Maybe I'll leave that to your supervisors to decide with you, but that's all my comments. Well done.
Thanks, Kyung.
Thanks, Kyung. Hey, Ron.
Yeah, I really like your presentation, and it's really well structured and needs to understand and follow all the flow. And also your the manuscript was quality of manuscript was great, and especially I really liked your the idea if it's feasible, So if clinicians can provide individualized, personalized the clinical session, then that's really fantastic. Probably that's a really ideal practice, and also probably all the clinicians, they want to do it. However, as you shows in your result, it's really difficult to collect data. So without collecting data, it's kind of a very intensive data collection. It's difficult to implement this idea. And this is, I think, really big threshold to achieve your feasibility. So my question is, I'm just thinking about some of the feasibility. So I'm just curious about the correlations between the important antecedent of depression, like the loneliness and the social interaction, satisfaction, and other disclosure, these kinds of things. Are they highly correlated each other?
I can't remember off the top of my head because that wasn't data I necessarily collected. I was just running it on an empirical data set. From memory, some of those variables were a bit highly correlated. I think like loneliness and I think perceived responsiveness. But yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Okay. Yeah. The reasons why I'm asking this question is I'm just thinking the practical implementation. So if they are, I don't know the correlations, but if their important antecedents are correlated each other, then if we just targeting one, the most important variable, regardless of individual differences, then the other, the related the variables can be also effective in some way. So of course, if you can implement your personalized intervention, then that'd be fantastic. But I think that when I read your method section, then also I was very curious about how many times you collected data. But if you ask me the answer complete, just answer 5 times a day for 2 weeks, then it's too much. Even I don't have any depression problems, and I'm an adult. But your target sample is young youth, the young generation with a weak mental health. So I'm not sure, although you implement this method into the clinical session, then still the client use people, they will accept that kind of the program. That's my one question, one comment. And the other one is, so now it's very difficult collecting data, and also you saw the clinician's reaction. Okay, this is really nice. This is really fantastic. However, I'm not sure this is feasible to implement their session. Then, do you have any plan to? Do you have any the research for future direction? So what is your future research?
For sure, yeah.
That's my one question. And the other one is, I'm also very curious about your data analysis. It's really interesting. And I'm also thinking that probably also maybe I can apply that kind of technology to my research. So do you think that now you are just looking at some certain the variables, the relationship outcome is your outcome is a depression, then do you think that can you apply this same methodology to other domain like education?
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, to answer the sort of the last question first, I mean, I definitely think there is value in time series Bruder and potentially IRMAX in other areas of psychology as well. I think in the end, I'd consider it a feature selection tool. So it helps us select certain features or predictors or variables. It selects stuff for us, and it can help us select things that are considered, I guess, important. So like I said, in my sort of field of psychology, I'm using it to select what predictors or things are clinically related to outcomes. But I mean, excuse me. through Valjinder and Joseph's big sort of research network, there have been a lot of other researchers that have reached out to ask to collaborate with Time Series Brood around other aspects as well. I think we've got one. Am I allowed to talk about this, Valjinder? I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. Like looking at things like diabetes, so more physical health related stuff and features of diabetes and sort of insulin levels and stuff like that. So I definitely think, yeah, there's value and it could be applied in the area of education as well. Yeah. And yeah, to answer the previous question around feasibility, no, I think you make a very good point. Although one thing I do want to add is I think, yeah, looking at how that data is collected might be sort of the next mini step first. Like I don't want to sort of necessarily just not give up, but like throw all that to the side. Yeah, I definitely think there can be improvements around how we collect that data. So I agree, even for me, like 5 times a day does seem like a lot. I was doing it myself first as well to see how it felt. And I think potentially, decreasing the number of predictors or processes that we're measuring could be helpful, because in the end, if we can reduce each sort of check-in to maybe 10, 20 seconds where they're just rating on a scale, how do you feel? Have you been doing this? I think that can reduce hopefully that sort of barrier, because it's not necessarily like we're getting to do a whole DAS 21, which takes 5 to 10 minutes to complete 5 times a day. It's very much on your phone. You could probably do it within, 30 seconds if you're really quick. And then like I was saying, if we can look at things like gamification or streaks or talking with clinicians about how they can increase motivation in clients and getting it done, whether it's, I don't know, mini rewards or things like that, both in the app and outside, and maybe talking with clients about the perceived benefits around what, collecting that data can do for them in terms of therapy. I think maybe for some of those more potentially anxious, over-controlling types, that, sorry, excuse me, it might not be as big of a barrier. But yeah, definitely, I think in terms of future research, I want to look at this idea of data collection first. Like, how can we try and fix that up before, I guess, looking at other possibilities in terms of how do we apply the whole approach.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm just very cognizant of time, so we'll have one quick question from the audience before we close up. Herb? You're on mute. Herb?
A couple of quick points. As I understand the basic findings, you've simulated data to represent semi or supposedly realistic scenarios, and then that were more complicated than many of approaches would use. And then you showed that the more sophisticated approaches were able to recognize what you build in. A couple of questions. Really, the issue on the number of data points, your number of data points is probably conservative because you're looking at the simulated data, and really complicated, more real data would be more complicated. The other issue is that the feedback that you got from clinicians, there's a famous personality study where they looked at personality profiles and astrology things that were not specific, and the astrology won out over the specific. And then there's also a cognitive dissonance effect that if you put effort into it, you want to believe that it's good. I don't think you have a good control for business as usual in terms of the usability of the data. Would have been interesting to have asked the clinicians to build a profile before you gave them the feedback, and then ask whether they learned anything new from the profile, or even ask what they normally would have done, and then ask if this would have, the feedback changed what they did. I've got more questions, but I'll let it go with that because we're running out of time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Herb. Yeah, no, for your point around the feasibility study, I definitely agree. And initially, when the initial plan, when we were recruiting youth and clinicians, that was sort of implemented as well. There was like a sort of brief questionnaire before they got the approach thing. I think part of it was from memory, getting them to rank as well, like what they felt like were the most important processes for that client, and then comparing that to what the algorithms came up with in the end as well. But again, unfortunately, because of the recruitment challenges and the time constraints of obviously the PhD and my sanity and stress levels, we had to sort of pivot to, I guess, a bit simpler. But I definitely agree with those points. In terms of simulation study, so in the MCR, actually, because I know it's in part 1 and part 2, so it gets a bit confusing. But so I actually simulated the data that was based on real world EMA data. And we sort of simulated, based on that. So we're trying to capture as much sort of like real world relationships as we could in that simulated data as well. And in the part 1 simulation study, we also did vary sort of how many time points in the simulated data as well. I think it ranged from 30 to up to 150 and 200 to see performance as well.
Thanks, Will. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. A lot of good feedback, a lot of interesting questions. Some of it sounds like it's ready for a postdoc. But in the interim, can you please give another round of applause for Will on a job well done?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time, and I'd just like to ask the final year review panel and his supervisory panel to stay online for deliberations, and for everybody else, thank you very much for your time and have a great afternoon. And Will, Virginia will be in touch. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Well done, Will.